Tonight on CU at USC, we speak with Dr. David Sack. He's an addiction psychiatrist and chief medical officer at Element Behavioral Health and Promises Treatment Center. I'll ask him about the disturbing rise in binge drinking already this semester here at USC. All that and more coming up right here on Trojan Vision. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to CU at USC. I'm Cole Sullivan, your host tonight. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Sack, for being here as well. I appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So I want to start kind of a little bit of a broader overview. Tell us, what do you do?
Well, I'm an addiction psychiatrist by training, which means that after I did a residency in general psychiatry to treat all ranges of disorders, I focused on the area of treating people with drug and alcohol problems. And so as an addiction psychiatrist, you really meet people at the beginning of their journey. There are people who typically recognize that they have a problem with drugs or alcohol, but they may not have really taken the first step toward overcoming that addiction. And so the work is divided at times. It's divided between education, teaching people what addiction is and how to manage through it, and treating the actual symptoms of their addiction. So you do detoxification to manage people through their withdrawal, and then you may use medications to help decrease their cravings, and you do a lot of therapy.
So give us kind of an idea. You said start off with education. What is addiction? What is addiction? What does that look like?
So the most recent definition we have, and not everyone agrees on what addiction is. You'd think by now it would be obvious, but comes from the American Society of Addiction Medicine, which describes addiction as a disorder of the brain's reward circuitry. What's amazing about that definition, this disorder of the brain's reward circuitry, is that it doesn't talk about drugs. It recognizes that people can be addicted to behaviors that also overstimulate the reward centers in the brain and cause a characteristic pattern of behaviors that we associate with addiction.
So the characteristic pattern of behaviors, when you say that, what are signs that people should look for in themselves or in others?
So typically when someone's addicted to a drug or alcohol or a behavior, they spend more and more time involved with it. They spend a lot of time thinking about it, thinking about how to get and obtain that drug or reward. They crave it. One of the things that changes in addicts compared to normal people is that if someone is just a casual drinker, they might want to have a drink after work or if they go to a party, but they don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. They're not thinking about the next drink they're going to get, how it's going to feel, how it's going to make them feel better or more alive. Once someone starts to drink, though, they have these intense cravings where they experience a kind of stress associated with not having the drug and how they're going to get the drug. So cravings are another example. People spend more and more money on their addiction. So even though they know they don't have the funds for it, they will spend money they don't have in order to get it. Typically, once someone's addicted, they'll continue that behavior in spite of consequences. And those consequences could be social, occupational, interpersonal, educational. But typical consequences could be getting arrested, getting thrown out of school, wrecking your car. So they continue that behavior in spite of those consequences.
And one thing that's really interesting is it's been a while now, but I took a class on the actual neurology of the brain and the way your brain pathways work, and you're way more knowledgeable about this anyway than I am. It changes when you're using these certain substances, these drugs, and that's kind of where that definition comes from, right? It's just the actual neural pathways.
That's right. And what happens is that initially most drugs of abuse stimulate the release of dopamine in the brain. And dopamine is the major reward chemical in the brain, and it's released from a very specific area. And when it's released, it basically tells your brain, this is really good stuff. And we have dopamine in the reward area of the brain, which is called the mesolimbic dopamine system, because we need to look for things that are necessary for survival. So things like water, food, salt, sex
evolutionary,
are inherently rewarding. So it's that same center, the nucleus accumbens, that is stimulated by drugs. And that repeated stimulation of the nucleus accumbens changes our memories and our thinking about how those drugs feel.
And so let's kind of bring it back to our college audience. When we're 18 to 24, how does addiction and how does that area of our brain, it's still developing, right? It's an area where it's really malleable still.
Well, the part of the brain that's more malleable is the cortex, the higher functions of the brain. But what happens when you stimulate the reward center is that it sends out signals to other parts of the brain. And the part that seems to be most involved in addiction is called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's a very specific area of the brain that's involved in judgment, in empathy, in impulsivity. And so when you stimulate that reward center abnormally, it changes the way people think about their rewards. And a good example is impulsivity. You know, most people can sort of wait for things. Nobody likes to wait, but they can wait. And so a good example would be, you know, you want to buy a TV set, but you have to wait till next week. So you wait. Well, people who are addicted are much more impulsive. They can't wait for their rewards. And you can measure this in lots of different ways, but there are actually sort of what are called economic experiments, where you ask somebody, do you want $25 today or $5 next week or $100 3 weeks from now? And what you see is that most people want whatever money they're going to get right away. But if you make that future reward big enough, they'll say, I'll wait. So if you say, well, would you wait a week to get $300 versus $5? You know, most people will say, yeah, I'll wait a week. Well, you can actually plot a curve that shows how impulsive someone is. And what you see is that in people who have been addicted or who are even first-degree relatives of addicts, they're much more likely to choose the immediate reward, no matter how big you make that future reward.
Interesting.
The thing that happens on campus, and I think this is a really important thing for your viewers, is not everybody who drinks or uses a drug is going to become addicted. And for most drugs, it's probably only 1 out of 7 people. And this is one of the hardest things for someone who's starting to become addicted, because they look around at their friends and they say, well, my friends drink and it's not a problem. And they're unable to sort of process what's different about their experience versus the person who's not at risk. And so, you know, we know that 90% of kids try cigarettes before they graduate high school, but only 1 out of 7, you know, actually becomes addicted. And it's the same thing for alcohol or opiates.
So if you're in that position where you're the 1 out of 7, and you're looking at your friends in college and you're saying they all drink, how do you know that something's different about you?
Well, I think a couple of things. The first is this preoccupation, that you can't tolerate the way you feel unless you're using, that there's a sense that the only time that matters is when you're high on that drug. So life itself has less and less meaning in the absence of that drug. If people use a lot, then they start to develop what's called tolerance. That means the brain is always trying to reset itself towards normal. So if you use a drug like alcohol, which is sedating and makes you sleepy, then your brain tries to compensate by turning up the on levers, in other words, the stimulating neurochemicals. So our brains are always trying to adjust. So what happens with tolerance is that it takes more and more drug to get the same effect. A casual user does not develop tolerance. It's only a regular heavy user that's going to develop tolerance to a drug. So someone who used to do 1 line of cocaine and is now doing, you know, a whole bag, that's an example of someone who clearly has tolerance. Withdrawal is the other sign. You know, your withdrawal is something that typically only happens once you're addicted to a drug. So, you know, in drugs that cause physical dependency, you get a physical withdrawal. Not every drug does.
So what are some of the ones that do?
So opiates and alcohol are probably the best examples of drugs that cause physical dependency. So when you stop alcohol, you get jittery, sweating, insomnia, tremulousness, shaking, hallucinations at times, inability to rest, relax, and at times seizures. So all of those symptoms are a result of your body now needing the sedative effects of the alcohol to be right, you know. So people talk about drinking before noon, not being able to stop drinking once you start, but these changes are subtle at first.
And subtle at first, and it's important, I would imagine, to catch them early before they develop into a longer habit?
Yeah, I think that some people know they're at risk. You know, people who have first-degree relatives with a history of alcoholism are at a much higher risk than people who don't. So, you know, if you know that one of your parents, mother or father, was an alcoholic and you're drinking heavily, you should be worried, because there's a good chance that you carry some of this genetic risk. And
it's a genetic risk. It's a genetic difference.
It is a genetic difference. We don't know exactly which genes yet. We've studied a lot of genes, and We haven't been able to identify the specific genes or genes, it's probably multiple genes that put people at risk. But the way in which you study genetics of alcoholism is you look at twins that are either raised together or raised apart.
Interesting.
And so identical twins have every gene in common. And so if they're raised, and one is raised in a house without alcohol and the other is raised in a family with alcoholism, you would expect that if it was the environment, that if one had it, the other one would not have it because it's all in the environment. But it turns out that all that matters is whether the parent had it.
So it's a genetic
50% of the risk is genetic.
And so I know some of the work that you do at Element and all of the Elements and all these other organizations you've been a part of, not just now, but kind of throughout your career, has worked with young adults, young people, college age. What do you see as the most common problems among college kids that you have addiction issues with?
So people's paths to addiction are different from one another. When you look at college age kids, they're often experimenting. There's a certain romanization of drug use, you know, doing more is better, seeing how extreme you can get is better. So there are a lot of people who may have trouble with drugs who are not addicted because they, you know, it's an age where people gravitate toward extremes. But the other thing that we see is that it's also an age where people are separating from the families they grew up in, and they may not be ready for the independence that they have. And so there's a lot of anxiety in being a young adult. You know, you're on your own, you have to make your own decisions. There's a fear of being alone. You know, are you going to be accepted? Are you going to have a peer group? I think the attraction of clubs and societies and fraternities is this need to be part of something.
There's a lot of stress with different schoolwork and with being on your own.
Multiple responsibilities. And then, you know, early adulthood is an age where many serious psychiatric disorders first rear their ugly head. So things like severe depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, all these things start to turn on at that age, including drug addiction. And so I think that, you know, that adds another level of stress to people, because if you're fighting depression or you're fighting anxiety, that's going to put you at greater risk to use certain drugs. And we see that a lot at Promises.
So is that the connection between those kind of those behavioral disorder, being depressed, anxiety, and drug addiction? Is it's using to fight those kinds of things?
Yeah. So when you look at it, probably somewhere around a third of the people who become addicted have had problems with depression or anxiety or abuse before they ever used a drug. And we think that it's sort of a self-medicating theory of drug use that says those folks are drawn toward drugs because the alcohol or the drugs give them some sense of calm. They're trying to quell that anxiety. Opiates are very powerful anti-anxiety medicines, and probably half of all the young adults that we see with opiate problems had anxiety problems before they ever took them.
Interesting. Well, I want to talk about, once you've identified this addiction, we've talked a lot about the brain chemistry behind it. What do you do about it? And that's what's coming up next in our next segment. I don't want to leave you hanging, but we'll talk about that when we come back from the break here with Dr. Sack. Stick around.
Sometimes you feel like life is fading away,
but TV's there for you night and day.
It really isn't fair, but they're taking us off air. If we don't prove our shows have viewers who really watch or care. Time has come to show us that you're there.
Otherwise the dean's gonna take our funding.
So turn on your TVs and open up your hearts,
So next year we don't have to broadcast from a parking lot.
so please keep us on air. I wanna get a job somewhere, 'cause he wants to make sure
So please keep us on air.
Welcome back to See You at USC. We're speaking with Dr. David Sack. He's an addiction psychiatrist. And Dr. Sack, in the first segment, we talked a lot about what is addiction, how you recognize it. But now that we've gotten to the point where you're recognizing what an addiction is, if you have one or if your friend has one, what's the next step? What do you do to treat that addiction?
Most people struggle with recognizing their addiction. And so what we say at Promises is that all treatment is consequence driven. It's not like someone wakes up in the morning and says, gosh, this is really a good day for me to get sober. Usually something happens to them. They get arrested, mother finds their stash, they drop out of school, and their parents find out that they flunked out, they crack up their car. So that a lot of times people aren't even thinking about getting treated when they're forced into treatment.
It's the
as
rock
a result
bottom kind
that's
of
right.
idea.
Well, they hit a consequence.
Yeah.
And so the first step really in treatment is to have an honest conversation about, well, why would you want to give up your drugs? In other words, how do you feel your life would be better if you weren't using versus whether you were using? And that conversation is really part of a technique called motivational interviewing, where you're sort of saying that in order for someone to stop using, that motivation has to be coming from inside of them. And so the role of the therapist is to really draw that out of them. And so you have to be prepared to say, well, why would you stop? And usually the first reaction is, well, hell no, I'm not going to stop. I'm just here because I have to appease somebody. And so it takes a while to have a conversation where you really can say, well, you're here for a reason. Tell me why you think you're here. Like, what got you here? And is that really a good thing or not? And when you start that process, people start to look at what's going on in a more objective way. So instead of trying to hammer someone over the head and saying, you're an addict, you have to admit you're an addict, and if you don't admit you're an addict, we can't treat you, you're really inviting them to have that conversation.
So it kind of draws it out of them themselves rather than kind of pushing it upon them.
That's right. It basically says different people have different motivations for why they would stop using. And so rather than try to apply a cookie cutter approach that says this is why you should stop, you're really asking them to evaluate how they got to where they are and what's really going on. And that process is called the contemplative phase, where you're trying to get people to at least contemplate treatment, and then you're going to move them to actually plan what they're going to do about their addiction and how they're going to get better, and then the rest follows.
So how does this differ from kind of the traditional model of a 12-step plan? How is this different? How is it similar?
So in 12-step recovery, the person is expected to admit that they're powerless over their addiction and that their life has become unmanageable. And so the way in which the process worked is that there was a lot of pressure for people to say, yep, you caught me, I'm powerless. There was a sense of shaming about it. I don't think that was the intention, but that's how many clients experienced it. And so, in a motivational interviewing model, you're basically saying everybody makes choices about their addiction, and no one is powerless, that treatment is self-directed, that what we want to do is to mobilize that power, I think in 12-step recovery, though, there is a positive side to it, which they're really saying is most people, to overcome their addictions, are going to need help. And that admitting that you're powerless is really about that you've lost control and that you need help.
You're asking for help. Yeah.
You're asking for help. That's right.
So after you've kind of passed in the method that you use at Promises, the contemplative phase, what's next?
So, usually this is going on at the same time as detox, so you're reversing the physical dependency that the person has on their medication. You're doing a physical exam to make sure they're physically healthy, because drugs are bad for you. They compromise your health. And then usually what's next is, you're trying to get people to look at their lives and understand the drivers. Why do they drink? And some of that you do or use drugs. You do some of that in individual therapy and some of that in group sessions, but understanding the things that trigger you, what the underlying issues are for that individual so that they can work on those in therapy.
And work on those in therapy. And so what happens when someone, kind of goes through this therapy, is and starting towards the path of recovery, and it just doesn't take? Sometimes it just seems like it doesn't work.
Yeah, so there are medicines that can help with addiction treatment. And so one of the medicines that's very widely used because it helps with alcohol and it can help with opiate dependency is a medicine called naltrexone. And what naltrexone does is it blocks the reward receptors in the brain in the opiate system. So if somebody drinks alcohol, they're going to find it less rewarding, so they'll be less likely to drink excessively. And if they use opiates, it'll block their effect altogether. So, you know, sometimes in people who don't have a lot of motivation early in treatment, you're going to say to them, well, you know, if you use this long-acting form of naltrexone, it's going to help you because you won't be able to make that decision about using. Right. And it also decreases craving. We don't know exactly why, but people who have a lot of preoccupation with getting drugs think about it less when they're on naltrexone. So there are these medicines that are anti-craving medicines, anti-addiction medicines that can make a big difference.
That can make a big difference, especially when used in conjunction with some of the more therapy methods that you guys do.
That's right.
Yeah. So I want to kind of shift the conversation a little bit to some more current events, if you don't mind. First, talking about in California this November, Proposition 64, which is legalizing marijuana for adult use over 21. And a big argument of people who are against this proposition say that, you know, 9 to 10% of people who use marijuana regularly become addicted to it, and that's an addiction cost that leads to, you know, car accidents and all these kind of more societal costs down the line. From a medical perspective, what's your insight onto that?
You know, we tried prohibition with alcohol and it didn't work. It puts billions of dollars in the hands of thugs and organized criminals. And I think we have the same problem with marijuana. As an addiction psychiatrist, I can tell you that if you make a drug more available, you will have more addicts because there'll be 9% of a bigger number. But if you're in a free society, I think this becomes a political question. How bad or good does a drug have to be happier with it illegal versus legal? So I really see that as a political question that I can't really answer. I think it's inherently more honest to legalize marijuana than to have medical marijuana because the medical uses from marijuana are very poorly researched. There's not a lot of conclusive evidence. And many people feel that it's just been a shill to allow people to have recreational marijuana. So I think, you know, once we get honest about it, that people are going to use marijuana recreationally and we're not going to sanction them for it, then I think we have a much more honest discussion.
An honest discussion that will lead eventually to treatment for those who need it.
That's right.
Hopefully. And another thing that I know you wanted to talk about as well is a new drug that's been made more widely available, and you've got to forgive me because I'm not going to remember the name.
That's
but
right.
it treats overdoses.
That's right. There's a drug naloxone, which is an opiate blocker that you give intramuscularly. That's been
which
used.
Means injected.
That's
like
right.
an
Injected in.
kind of thing.
That's right. Into the muscle. That reverses the effects of opiates. And we're in the middle of an opiate epidemic. So for the last 25 years, the rate at which opiates are being used keeps going up. And there are now more prescriptions for narcotic analgesics, which are what opiates are. They're drugs similar to morphine and heroin, than there are people in the United States.
Wow.
And the number of overdose deaths now exceeds the number of deaths due to automobile accidents. So we're talking about 50,000 people a year dying from overdose, about 45,000. So naloxone has been around and has been used by paramedics and first responders for years to reverse overdoses. The problem is they rarely get to the overdoses in time. And so as part of a public safety movement, given how epidemic the overdose deaths are, is you can now get a prescription for naloxone even if you're not an identified patient. So relatives of people who have relatives who are addicts can get naloxone. People who just want to have it for safety can get naloxone. And so it's really important because, you know, the people who are most likely to overdose are not necessarily addicts. They may be social users or they may be partiers who are using drugs for the first time, but they don't have tolerance necessarily. And so if you have a drug like naloxone available, like in every fraternity house or every sorority house or every dorm, then you're going to have access to it much more quickly and be much more likely to be able to save a life because then it can be administered by someone who's not a medical specialist. And it now comes in two forms. There's a nasal spray and then there's an auto-injector, so you can inject it right through the clothes. You don't even have to have any special skill. So I think that, you know, the way I look at it is that there are many people who are taking these pills who are not addicted, who are at risk for overdoses, and those are the ones who are going to be at a very high risk that we can do something about.
And these kinds of, this particular medication is available and seems, you know, it saves lives.
It saves lives, yes, absolutely. You know, one of the things that people don't realize is, you know, drug dealers are not honest. And so people often think they're buying OxyContin or hydrocodone, and these are commonly prescribed narcotics, and then, you know, they're getting fentanyl now. So again, fentanyl is a much more potent opiate. It's a synthetic, it's cheap to make.
And that can lead to more
overdoses.
I want to ask you about a report that came out. It was in the Daily Trojan, our college newspaper here, just this week or late last week, about binge drinking on campus. Already there have been 40+ transports from campus to area hospitals for people who have had too much to drink. Why do you think this kind of is part of this culture in college, and what can we do about it?
Well, you know, as an addiction psychiatrist, I can remember coming up to USC on game day and being a little bit horrified by the river of alcohol running through campus. You know, I think that people remember their glory days, you know, and I think that there's a view that alcohol was a positive in their college experience, and it's part of, you know, the whole atmosphere of college. I think we don't exactly know why binge drinking is increasing, but we know it is. It's particularly increasing among younger women and women of childbearing age, and it is increasing the number of emergency room visits. Most people who binge drink are not alcoholics, and so it's very hard sometimes to have a conversation with them, because you'll say, well, you really shouldn't drink this way. And for your viewers, binge drinking is typically defined as 5 or more drinks in a 2-hour period for men and 4 or more for women. The point is that you say, well, you're drinking too much, and say, well, I'm not an alcoholic. And that's true. They're not an alcoholic. But binge drinking is dangerous in its own right. And what happens is that the person who's most likely to wind up in an emergency room for alcohol poisoning is a naive drinker. It's someone who doesn't have tolerance, who's typically drinking at a party, doesn't know when to stop.
It's often why you see it early in the semester when people are adjusting back to college.
Early in the semester, younger, below age, that kind of stuff.
And I want to ask you one last question, and this is perhaps the most important question, is if you or someone you know, a friend that you have, you think is suffering from addiction, what's the thing that you should do?
Well, you don't want to ignore it. I think that people often hope for the best, that they turn a blind eye to it. I think the first thing you want to do is to have a conversation with them. And to say, you know, I've been watching what you're doing, you know, you're using drugs every day, you're drinking every day, I think you're getting into trouble with it. You know, I'm very concerned about you. There's a good chance that the first time you have that conversation with someone, they're going to blow it off. But, you know, the second time they may not, or if they're in the emergency room, you know, after a drug episode, an overdose, they may not. I think the second thing you have to consider is, can you recruit people that know and care about them to help with this? So very often, if someone's away at school or their family members don't know what they're doing.
Right.
And
so if you can bring those people in, you can really provide a support network that can really make a difference. And of course, an important thing to note is that USC also has resources available at the health center that also do this for our viewers. Thank you so much, Doctor, for coming in. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's really my pleasure.
All right, and thank you for watching. See you at USC. We'll see you next time. Good night.
You're watching Trojan Vision. For more of your favorite shows, check us out at trojanvision.com and like us on Facebook.